Hello. So, what follows is the next installment of my series with Karin. Unfortunately, owing to my own, how should we say, failures with regards to recording, I clipped off the beginning of the sentence when Karin starts in this next episode. So, therefore, I'm just recording this little bit as an additional introduction. Just to let the listener know, Karin has returned from London and is now back in Germany. It's 1990, and what follows is essentially the story that takes Karin through the 90s and towards her role with pen. Enjoy.
Come relatively rapidly. So in 1990, in June, I found myself back in Germany, where I actually didn't want to be because I wanted to get out again. But it's wonderful because at the time, the political situation was so interesting that I decided, if I have to go back to Germany, it's the right time. And my brother and his family were kind enough to take me in again, and I could even occupy the room I'd had 30 years ago. And because my niece was, I think she was at the university already. So after 3 months, I found a place in Cologne, which I rented, and unsettled. I had a place. I bought myself, of course, some electronic equipment now. That was the first thing. But I was traumatized. I was in turmoil, and at the same time, I was empty. I didn't know how it would continue and would go on. And then, piece by piece, there were new strings that pulled me ahead. And I'll mention them right now briefly. One was the only two people I knew in Cologne. They were the editor and the cultural editor of the German medical journal. They took me under their wing and pushed me. They asked me to join the jury of a literary prize by the Medical Association, which I did. The first book I was really impressed by was a book that Horlemann had printed. I met Jürgen Horlemann for the first and only time, unfortunately, when the prize was given to the Romanian writer who had written a book in German on Dracula, a very ironical book, a very literary book. And I had pushed through that he was going to get the prize. Through that, I met, of course, the Horlemanns. I think you should tell your association with the Horlemanns. I fell in love with all of them. Jürgen had died, but his wife and the two children were very close to my heart. They still are. And so through the Horlemann and their publishing came one of the first interesting projects, a book on modern poetry from Nigeria. And it was published by Horlemann. I did much of the editing and most of the translation. And it's even got us closer by working together. The next string that pulled me along was, of course, pen. And there was a string that had existed before through the Berlin project that we had in London, that friends in East Berlin invited me to come, and I did go, particularly to see what the falling of the wall had done to East Germany. I'd seen it before. Now I saw it in turmoil, in ruins, basically. And there were two events that really made me think in terms of what happened in East Berlin, because I was there with a journalist at Nalepa Straße, which is where the GDR radio had been. And
this is in Schöneweide, isn't it?
No, it's. Is it in Schönweide? I don't remember.
It's southeast Berlin, right on the Spree, I think, isn't it?
At that time, I didn't have my bearings in Berlin yet. The journalist and all her colleagues were let go that day. They had gotten notice, and under the auspices of a Bavarian journalist or director of journalism, they didn't have a chance to come back into their profession, most of them. They had been told that no more than 20% would be re-employed after three types of vetting, meaning political vetting, personal vetting, and so on and so forth. A year later, I was with an American friend, neighbors from London. He was working for American universities, trying to find universities they could twin with. And he took me to Greifswald and to Rostock, because he needed a German voice, a translator. So I was there exactly the day that everybody at the television station got notice. And not 20%, not 20% were going to be rehired. And the university people, likewise, the university people were all let go. And everything, in a way, was being destroyed. And that colored my feelings about the falling of the wall. I had hoped that there would be a closer connection, a closer understanding of each other. The East Germans pretty well knew what was going on in West Germany, but the West Germans had no clue what was going on in the East. So I felt like in the middle. But of course, it was very important for me, and I was happy that I was close enough to observe all of this. The pen string.
Can I, before we jump into pen,
yes,
just because it's very interesting also for me, because I wasn't around at the time. I was sitting at home in London, a very comfortable 13-year-old, 12 or 13-year-old when all of these events transpired. But since coming to Berlin, since getting to know many students who were both former East Germans and both former West Germans, and listening to the different stories, listening to the different experiences, because the social element is really what is important for me. And the other day I was talking with another person I do a podcast with, Alvaro, and the subject of that podcast was Rohwedder. Do you remember him? Who was
yes.
He was responsible for, he was a Treuhand agency and responsible for managing the transfer of ownership from former state in the East Germany, state ownership, to private enterprise, essentially from either Western Germany or from other sort of companies around the world. And this proved an extremely unpopular enterprise. I think for many of the reasons that you there have suggested, and some people really don't, I think, understand, and I'm one of those, how bad it must have been that not only have they gone through a complete change of their country, their government, their way of life, But on top of that, to very quickly be told, oh, now this is democracy. Now you've got access to the rest of the world. Their companies change, and then they're let go. You were there, you spoke to these people. Could you just give us like a few words about how the emotional side was of this? Because this huge change within their lifetimes is something that we will probably never experience.
They were devastated. Most of them were devastated. Their livelihood was taken. And that was the worst thing. They were told that what they had lived through was worthless. They were now in a system that was worth it, and they better comply, which was very hard to do and to take for particularly very intelligent people. And some of the East Germans who had the privilege of traveling into foreign countries knew exactly what was happening, and they were speechless. Many of them later couldn't live in East Germany anymore, not because they did not have any livelihood there, but they couldn't fathom that all they had lived through in the GDR was brushed aside, and they were brushed aside, and they wanted to start over again on their own terms. And most of them by that time were in their retirement age, those I knew. And they integrated relatively well in West Germany, but they had contact with West Germany and the West before. So it was easier for them. But those who had never had contact, who had never been able to travel to the West, only to the East, to Hungary and so on, they were thrown into a system where they didn't know the signals. When you come into a foreign country, it's not just the language, it's the signals. What does it mean when somebody winks? What does it mean when somebody slaps you on the back? What does it mean when a sign says, don't cross the lawn? Does it really mean you are not allowed to cross the lawn? Because in your country, there's no question, of course you can cross the lawn. All these things came into the picture and made it so very difficult for many of my friends, I must say. The writers had contact with West through pen, through literary agencies, through literary conferences, and so on and so forth. It was easier for them, although they were more furious than the others because they knew what was going to happen. So I was.
Sorry. I was going to ask a question, but please continue.
No, I always felt in the middle because I could understand the situation in East Berlin and the East Berliners almost better than the Germans who were up on a high horse.
Mm. And previously you mentioned that the first time that a male counterpart or colleague or project participant took you seriously and respected your opinion as an expert, as a knowledgeable individual, this first experience occurred in the former East Berlin, you said, when you were doing research. And I've also spoken to other former East Germans, and they also confirmed, not that there was a need to confirm, but they confirmed that the role of women in the former East Germany was equal. There was no sentiment of a woman had less of an importance or that she had to stay at home. Not at all. They said that we always knew that if men worked, women had to work too. And so they maintained the same level of importance. After reunification, did you sense that some women felt a bit more uncertain about what their roles would be in this new reunified Germany? Or did you sense the fact that, the former East German women were of such strong character that they would carry any new burdens that came with the process?
It was a mixed situation because those who had been strong as women in the GDR and had internalized that strength, had no problem showing the strength when they came to the West or when they had dealings with the West. But of course, if you don't find jobs, and it was the women particularly who didn't find jobs, the men didn't either, but it was more women who all of a sudden were out of a job, and that really tore them down. They became less vocal, which surprised me, because I'd met them as very strong and very vocal and with their own opinion, also against their husbands or friends, or they didn't abide by what they were supposed to think and say, and that changed a bit. There was a subdued atmosphere about women from the East when they came to the West.
Yeah, that's a real shame. And it's also something I wanted to highlight because I think it's important. And as you were there on the ground and you spoke with the people at the time, I value it obviously, as always, but that additional input that because of the personal interactions that you had with them.
As I said, I was at Nalepa Straße with a friend, a journalist. We were planning on doing something east-west, a German project, and that was the day when they got their notice. She almost disappeared from the picture, and she was a strong journalist. She was a literary journalist, and she disappeared. There was no job for her anymore. And that really hurt me personally.
And did you have any interactions with her later?
A couple of times, yes. But sad to say, she became an alcoholic. She, like many journalists who are close to the bottle, she couldn't handle it anymore, and she became a real hardcore alcoholic.
That's a shame. So before I interrupted you, sorry about that. You were about to go on to Penn, which was the other string, as you said, that pulled you forward. So you've already, at this point, obviously, you've had interactions with Penn. You knew how they worked before because of your experiences elsewhere. And you've made... were you familiar with some of the people in Penn in Germany from your work beforehand?
Not really. A couple, yes, because we had visitors from Germany in London, but there was a certain feeling of distrust between the exile writers community and the German community, the German writers. They came to offer a hand, but unfortunately our friends in London were very, very, they didn't quite trust them. So it was a strained atmosphere, which became easier later once I was in a different position in both Penn centers, and that will take us to the end of the 90s.
Okay, so your first then experiences of Penn in Germany as a returning citizen in Germany.
It was easy because I was asked to represent German-speaking writers abroad, London, in Germany when they had their congresses or meetings, and German Penn invited me as a representative of German-speaking writers abroad to come to their meetings and to some international meetings as well. So again, I was privileged being pushed by both sides and making friends easily with a lot of people in German Penn. I'm talking about West German Penn, because there was an East German Penn, which I got not I had met quite a number of East German pen members already in East Berlin, so I was more familiar with the East German pen end. But then I became very close to some West German pen members, particularly here in Cologne. A friend who just unfortunately died recently, 3 days ago.
I'm sorry to hear it.
And through other meetings, I met the then president of Kurdish Pen. He is still a very close friend, and his son, who is now in his 30s, I've known, like Lena, your wife, when they were very young. The Kurdish connection stayed on a personal level, yes. The Kurdish Pen later was taken over by elements that didn't let my friend continue as president. He stepped out and he got into a lot of trouble. The police called him and said, "You are on the death list of the PKK." At which point he called me and said, "I don't want to have that talk with the police alone." So I went, and I again was all right in the middle. They started to protect him, and his 4-year-old son was driven in a armored car to kindergarten. They had to have an iron door at their apartment. And since I'd known him through Pen, I could ask the International Pen in London, when they invited all members to a Prague conference in the mid-90s, to please invite the whole family. It's no use just inviting him. His wife needs a respite too, and the boy needs to see some people without police protection. The police did protect us. Every 50 kilometers on the highway, on the motorway, was stationed a police car. So it was very obvious. They were looking that we were getting through all right. And I told them that we don't need any protection in Czechoslovakia because there will be protection at the conference, because we had the only woman who ever was under a fatwa from Bangladesh there, and she was heavily protected. So the whole thing was, the whole conference was under police surveillance, so to speak. This was a funny thing, we got into Czechoslovakia, and all of a sudden I said, "Oh, my friend's wife said, "Oh, look, there's a restaurant that the name is something like Aunt Maria. It's a Turkish restaurant." And while she was talking about Turkish and restaurant, I was looking at the dividing line of the highway, and there was a police car from the Czechs. So they were even protecting us there. These were things that got me into an international kind of Germany, which it has stayed. Most of my friends come from outside. I have a lot of friends who got in touch again from school times, and I made some new friends here in Cologne. So I also re-entered a personal Germany and was kind of carried by my friends.
Okay, so just to reiterate, so in 1990, when you returned to Germany from London, you went to Mönchengladbach, you stayed with your brother, and a few months later is when you established yourself in Cologne.
Yes.
Essentially, all right, cool. And from this point on is where the strings that you've mentioned so far began to pull you along and so on. At what point did you solidify your position with pen? Did this come much later?
This came around 99 because I did not switch from German-speaking writers abroad to German pen until 97. And 2 years later, I was voted in as vice president and in charge of writers in prison. But that's a different story.
Yeah.
There was another string that kept me busy and kept me thinking and working, and that was the Rushdie. The Rushdie support committee in Germany was formed by a set of friends, and they pulled me in there, and I was happy to help and be the English-speaking intermediary between London and Cologne. And we worked for years as a defense committee for Salman Rushdie, and even on the suggestion of one of our friends, boycotted Lufthansa because they weren't carrying Rushdie, and with a group of signatures, which we all collected, particularly one of our members who was and is famous, we were able to change the rules of Lufthansa. And when Lufthansa started carrying Rushdie again, other airlines did too. The British did too. The French had always carried him because they said we cannot ostracize somebody who is being under pressure anyway.
And this is because of his book Satanic Verses, I guess. When
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
The fatwa was of 89. It was a death sentence basically by the religious leadership of Iran.
Yeah.
And there were millions of dollars promised to those who would kill him. And as from what we knew, during the first 6 or 7 years, there were at least 8 missions from Iran to England to kill him.
This is under Khomeini, but when Khomeini died, did the fatwa continue, as far as you were aware?
Absolutely. I'm sure it's still on.
Okay.
But he's in America, and he's safer there than he ever was. In England, he had the same level of protection that the Queen had.
Okay. I mean, safety, I guess, is a relative term, isn't it? Because when I read the book by Roberto Saviano, if you remember, when he went undercover in Napoli, Gomorrah, I think was the book. And I believe the Gomorrah, they kind of said, we'll get you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, he's still writing and he's still alive, but I mean, he has to live every day now with the knowledge that any day could be his last. So I mean, I'm not sure how persistent the this fatwa is with regards to people actually after him, but it's enough to simply have that thought in the back of your mind that when you wake up, this could be my day.
I think that Rushdie was relatively well protected. He was relatively strong. He appeared at some international pen congresses. We heard of it mostly about an hour before he came. The saying was that they couldn't pull together a group of people to kill him with less than 24 hours. So there was always a 24-hour period where you could hint to the fact that Rushdie was coming. And so I had seen him quite a bit on the podium in Penn events, and we had a meeting in London, a reception, and he came to Leipzig to the book fair, and it in the end disappeared. The pressure disappeared, and our committee kind of fell apart. No, it didn't disintegrate. It just faded away.
Okay. And this so this committee began not in 89, but when?
In the early 90s. I don't remember quite when it was. I should think 92. There were committees in England and in Scandinavia and so on, and the German committee had already formed in a way. So it might have been 1993, 94, because between 91 and 93, I had 2 extremely busy years because of the Women Writers Committee, which had originated in Maastricht in 1990. The Women Writers Committee was formed by about 16, 17 women present at the International Congress. With me was my publisher and friend from London, and the 2 of us, of course, happily signed the founding document. And a year later, the committee was granted an amount of money for a workshop at the Frankfurt Book Fair. One of our members had close connections to UNESCO and got the money. But I was asked to pull it together and to organize it because I was the only one who was living in Germany, and I had been loosely voted in as a European coordinator. So I had to pull together this workshop on South-North publishing, meaning a workshop for 20 women writers from around the world, from the South and from the Eastern countries, with some 10, 15 publishers from around the world and 10 members from our Women's Committee. The money that we had was less than 1/10 less than 20% of what we needed. So because something that I had never thought of was all of a sudden there was envy. Somebody wanted to organize it from New York, and which of course was impossible. So what had been a supporter became a torpedo. And I was in the end alone with some friends from the committee to find the money in Germany, in ministries. We didn't have many publishers who gave money. In the end, it was piecework, because it was in batches of $200 that I had to fight for. And I had money to employ an assistant for 1 week. She was fantastic. She was absolutely fantastic. She could, after that week, could take over in Frankfurt at the book fair, where I was in charge of 40 people who had to be housed in Mainz, who had to be lugged back and forth, who had their workshop, and I had to man the stand at the book fair and deal with the interviews and so on and so forth. It took me 2 years to pull this together, and another 3 months to account for the money to the ministries in particular. And by that time, I was absolutely without power. I was
drained, as it were.
Not just drained. I developed heart problem because I, of course, felt we can't give the money back because we have spent it. Some of our friends were saying, it doesn't matter if we have spent it. We can stop the workshop, which was against my inner rule. If you have taken money and you can possibly do something positive with the money, in the sense of a workshop or of helping women writers in foreign countries, I simply worked day and night, and it was at the same time a very rewarding event, and it was very rewarding to have quite a number of friends there from Turkey, from Romania, from Slovenia, from all of them PEN members I'd known before. So PEN was a very, very strong support system for me. And to give back, I later became involved actively in German PEN and then in international PEN.
Before, obviously, I don't think we're going to be able to get on to your official roles within PEN until the next session, but it's really important, I think, also that we identify some of the issues that you had in establishing this committee for women writers. Why was it so difficult? Why was it so hard to achieve your funding objectives? Why did you have so much competition from other areas in creating the work and the program that you wanted to create?
We did not have any former experience with a women's group and how to organize it. The organizer was sitting in New York, and as I said, it was very difficult to work with her. The presidency of the Women's Committee went around the world. So when it was in Kathmandu, not everybody could keep in touch or go there when there was a meeting there. Then it came to Mexico, and they had different concerns than we had had. We had wanted to strengthen ties to African women, particularly. And the African women, in fact, were just as strong and just as secure in their lives as anybody in the West was. But they didn't have the public that we had. And I had gone in there to really open up the two-way street to Africa and Asia and the East. And that was not the purpose for some of the people. Some of them, you have that in men's groups as well. Some were in there for themselves, for their reputation. So it basically simmered down. It did not become an international committee that was active everywhere. It centered either in Asia or in Mexico or wherever. The membership switched. The Europeans, all of the Europeans were basically pushed aside because they had different ideas than those who were then running the Women's Committee. It depends on who is there. It depends on who is a member. It depends on who is the president, what the committee can do and does. The Writers in Prison Committee, of course, helps men and women. So the Women's Committee cannot really deal with persecuted women writers. They can only deal with empowerment, and that's difficult for most people.
And another question, just along the lines of what we see today. How do you feel the interactions? How equal did you see one another? So when you were dealing with people from Mexico or the USA or Kathmandu, the interactions, did you consider one another as equals? I know that you did, but do you think that in some other areas it was not so equal?
There were some uppity feelings. We have to help the Africans. They don't have access to writing. They have a system, they have a culture that does not let women write, except that the African women that were in the group were very well established writers. They came from chiefs' families. They had been given the same education as their brothers had. So it was a kind of culture clash. And some particularly on the American side, it was we have to help them. We are in a position. We have to empower them. No, they were empowered. They just needed contacts. The same contacts actually everybody needs who writes. And it fell apart on that end. The East Europeans after 90, or shortly after 95, established themselves within their countries as writers, or had been writers and journalists before, and were just as well established as any of us. So the need for a women's writers' committee, as it had been envisioned in the beginning, was not needed anymore.
So this is almost. Sorry. Yeah. I was just going to say this it has the same sort of symbology of this Western privileged but unfortunately ignorant people who say, okay, well, we have so much, they have so little, we have to give them. And even though there is at some point along the line a positive intention, the way in which those intentions are portrayed or presented suggest this form of erroneous superiority. Would you say that there was an element of this?
Yes, to some degree. The other difference was the military feminism versus African womanism, which is totally different. And if you go in there with ideological aims, it couldn't but fail.
That's interesting. Can you give me some insight into African womanism? Because that's the first time I've heard that term, and it's intriguing.
It's pro-women, at the same time not against men. Women in Africa, in the African cultures, in most African cultures, are the breadwinners anyway. They are the market women. They do the farming. So in a way, they are established, and they don't need the anti-male thrust. they need the respect of the male, which they don't get through Western style feminism, and they knew that very well.
I mean, I've also read situations where there are some countries in Africa where a woman is not allowed to own property. So therefore, if her husband dies, then she's essentially without a home because she's not allowed to then inherit the home. So as in, there are some elements within some African nations where there are difficulties for women, and I'm sure you're not moving away from that. But
no, I'm not. I'm only putting it in context. My mother was not allowed to enter the bank account which had been in her name, had been opened in her name by my father. She was not allowed to get any money out of it without his approval. She was not allowed to get a job without his approval. Into the 50s, in part, these restrictions existed in the 60s and 70s in Germany.
Yeah, I heard a woman could not claim that she had been raped by her husband until after the 70s. I think the law was changed in the 70s.
Probably even later, yes. Yes. So these things in Africa is not one country. It's a huge continent with different cultures and different backgrounds. That's true. But in most let's say Nigeria, Kenya, and so on, so for the big countries, the need for American-style ideological feminism is not there, and they resent it, and that was also a problem.
So these are all issues which obviously you were completely well aware of before you entered the official arena of PEN. And sort of undertook some of the responsibilities within that role. Did you consider it a part of your job to try to bring together these different elements, to try to find a common language?
In a setup like the Women's Committee, you couldn't. That was maybe 30 people in different parts of the world. If you were lucky, they communicated. There was a paper or a newspaper which came out every 3 months, and that was done mostly in Mexico. Let me put it this way: the committee became very pedestrian.
Okay. And does it still exist, this particular committee?
It still exists. It still meets, but it's the committee that has least effect, I would say. There's another committee which the Peace Committee, which was established in former Yugoslavia and Slovenia. It came out of the peace committees of the Yugoslavian era, and it still exists. It is they had a literary conference in Bled every year. The inviting center was the Yugoslavian center, and later it became the Slovenian center. Slovenia was the first country accepted as independent. So Bled became a yearly event. They had their conference, their literary conference, and alongside they had a meeting of the Peace Committee. And for a long time, it was Slovenian PEN who chaired that committee, and it always depends on who chairs a committee, what is done with it, and who is pulled into it. And the Peace Committee in many countries, in many pen centers was neglected for a long time. I don't know what it is right now, whether it has established itself independently. I don't think so.
Okay. I mean, it is fascinating, and something that I have learned over the years of my involvement within groups is that there is a completely different view of things from the outside. Sometimes it's possible for an organization to put across this united front where people simply do not see the infighting, the disagreements, the political discord, and so on. But it's not always possible to do that. And so therefore it does require a very professional facade to represent the unity that is needed for an organization like this to function. And it's interesting also that here we have these committees which also exhibit these traits. So there are problems within, and yet still they produce stuff on a quarterly basis where whoever reads it says, oh, look at the wonderful work that they're doing, without in any way knowing how difficult it is actually for any work to be done in the way that it could be.
Within a PEN as an organization has very little infights. They know one another, they meet one another pretty regularly. These representatives of different PEN centers who come to London or come to conferences usually are the same. What holds the international PEN together is mainly Writers in Prison. The Writers in Prison Committee, there are no infights. We're all fighting for the same cause. The efforts for exiles is also pulling together. The PEN as such is a very strong and very laudable exercise in humanity and humanism. And this is why I was very proud of being involved in Writers in Prison, Writers in Exile for so long.
So it would seem that the importance of the task, the principles of freedom, liberty, the right to express oneself, the right to live in a way which essentially protects the dignity of intelligence and life. These were obviously strengthening factors for those committees that you there mentioned.
Absolutely, because first of all, the committees started during politically rough times. PEN never was a writers' union where you supported your neighbor to get a publisher or to find publication outlets. It was always there to represent the freedom to write and the freedom to publish to this day. Of course, we now have also publishing associations, but PEN is very, very important in terms of writers. For a long while, we were also trying to protect the journalists that got under pressure. But by now, there are quite a number of associations that for the protection of journalists. That PEN is the only one, the only organization worldwide that is fighting for the freedom to speak, to write, and for the freedom to live as a writer.
Okay. So this brings us wonderfully to the next stage, which you will talk about then as a member of PEN, a leading member of PEN in Germany, and thereafter your career within PEN International. And that will be I think the focus of our next session, unless I'm mistaken.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. Okay, Karin, what can I say? I had the pleasure of you on Easter Friday, and now I've been able to speak to you on Easter Monday. And I'm really looking forward to the next episode. So, again, thank you very much for your time and your patience.
Thank you. And you decide what the next date will be.
Okay, we'll have a quick chat now, and
Yeah.
and then we can get that all organized. So, from me, thank you and all the best.
Thank you so much.